Mr. Commissioner, my remaining 45 minutes, I'm going to basically touch on 3 topics in 15-minute chunks. We'll go through this at a bit of a galloping pace. The first topic is going to be a discussion primarily with Dr. Ford about cetaceans, and in that respect, it's going to be mostly about killer whales and Pacific white-sided dolphins. Secondly, we're going to have a discussion primarily with Mr. Elysiak about pinnipeds, and that will focus largely on stellar sea lions. And finally, we're going to have a few policy-oriented questions in the last 15 minutes. So, Dr. Ford, could you briefly describe your general duties and activities as the head of the Cetacean Research Program?
My research activities? Sorry?
Your employment duties, your research activities,
right.
The panoply.
I'm program head for the Cetacean Research Program, and our mandate is to undertake studies on the conservation status of threatened and endangered cetacean, whale, dolphin, and porpoise species that are listed under the Species at Risk Act. And this involves a wide range of studies of their distribution, abundance, feeding ecology, and these kinds of questions.
So to be clear, the only species that your program is researching are species listed under SARA.
The great majority of our funding support comes from the Species at Risk program within Fisheries and Oceans Canada. We have received some funding to address questions on non-listed species as well, but that's a minor role of our work at present. And
which are the species then that are the more major focus of your program at present? Can you give us an idea of those SARA-listed species that you most focus on?
Well, the priority is based on the level of endangerment, really, for each species. And so the endangered species include the large whales like blue whales, sei whales, North Pacific right whales. Also, one of the populations of resident-type killer whales, the southern residents, are also endangered, and so they have some priority. But then other species include, at the threatened level, include the fin whale, humpback whale, and 3 different populations of killer whale: the northern resident killer whale, the transient killer whale, and offshore-type killer whale. These are populations that are considered distinct by the Species at Risk Act and by COSEWIC. So they're essentially treated like separate species.
And could you just briefly describe those 3 ecotypes, or essentially different species of killer whales that you just mentioned, the transients, the offshores, and the residents? Could you in particular describe the prey preferences of each of those 3 species or populations?
Fine. The killer whale is an unusual animal. It's the ocean's apex predator. Nothing preys on killer whales, but it potentially can prey on most organisms in the ocean. And it has an unusual. It has evolved in an unusual way to be highly specialized on different prey types, even in waters where these different populations, these different specialized groups overlap. So in this part of the world, in the northeastern Pacific, we have resident killer whales, which are fish-feeding specialists, primarily salmon, but also some ground fish and the occasional squid. We have, in the same waters, transient-type killer whales. These do not mix with the residents. They're genetically different. They're socially isolated from one another. And this population feeds almost exclusively on marine mammals, that is seals, sea lions, dolphins, porpoises. Occasionally they'll take some seabirds, but they do not feed on fish whatsoever, to our knowledge. And the third type is a rather poorly known ecotype referred to as offshore killer whales. This is a population that seems to be quite small, perhaps 500 animals, ranges widely up and down the continental shelf. Our knowledge of its diet is rather poor, but we have recently documented them preying on large sharks, Pacific sleeper sharks, which are a rather deep water shark. And because of extensive teeth wear in this particular population, where the teeth are worn flat, we have hypothesized that they must prey extensively on sharks. Perhaps they're shark specialists because the abrasive nature of the skin of sharks would cause extensive tooth wear, the kind of wear that we just don't see in the other ecotypes, the resident and transient killer whales.
In your opinion, do any of these three ecotypes of killer whales have the potential to have any marked predation impacts on Fraser River sockeye, and how confident are you of your assessment of each of those three ecotypes?
Well, I would start with the highest confidence that they're not, and that would be the transient killer whale, because we have, in 30 years of observing predation by this particular type of animal and by examining stomach remains of stranded whales, we have yet to see any predation on any species of fish. So I would be the most confident of that. Offshore killer whales, we're by far less certain. It is possible they prey on some salmonids, but to the extent to which we don't know. But their distribution pattern does not seem to coincide with the migration timing and location for any salmonid, especially sockeye salmon. So I would be surprised that they feed significantly on any salmonid, in particular on sockeye.
Just to be clear, though, you wouldn't be able to, with any confidence, quote, rule them out.
No, would not be able to rule them out as preying it to some degree on salmonids, including sockeye.
Okay.
And then for the resident type killer whale, we've been studying them extensively using a combination of recovery of prey fragments from the site of kills extensively on the coast, including Haida Gwaii and the whole coast of British Columbia from Alaska to Washington State. And over the last 20 years or so, we've collected over 800 samples of scales and bits of tissue from over 800 kills by these whales, and of those, only 4 have been, those are salmonids, only 4 have been sockeye. This discovery was a surprise to us when we realized that sockeye seems to be insignificant in their diet, because the whale's occurrence in these migratory corridors for salmon heading to the Fraser River coincides quite strongly with not just sockeye, but with pink salmon and other very abundant species of salmon. And so we long assumed that they preyed widely on different species of salmon, but it was only when we started recovering these prey fragments and actually keying them out by unique features of their scales, which allows species identification as well as aging, and also using more recently genetic techniques to identify tissue samples, that we realized that they are very much targeting Chinook salmon, which represents almost 3/4 of all the kills that we've documented, which was a great surprise because numerically Chinook salmon are outnumbered by over 500 fish to 1 in most cases, for example, compared to sockeye or pink salmon. So we've thought a lot about why this must be so, or why they are so specialized, and it appears that the Chinook's life history strategy is such that they're available to these resident killer whales in their range throughout the year, unlike other species like pink and sockeye that spend much of their life cycle on the high seas and are essentially unavailable to these whales. And also, we believe that they target Chinook salmon because they're so much larger than the alternative salmonids, ranging up to 20 kilograms or more, many times the size of a single sockeye, for example. And also that they tend to have the highest fat content or energy content of all the salmonids. But what is still surprising to us, or was, that much of our sampling and observations of predation by these killer whales takes place at the peak of the sockeye migrations, which in some years can be very extensive, in areas like Johnson Strait, Juan de Fuca Strait, the sort of migratory corridors. Yet, even though we could see sockeye in the water in great numbers schooling, when the whales made kills, invariably they have turned out to be Chinook salmon. Secondarily of interest is chum salmon and coho, but pink and sockeye just do not appear to be significant prey.
And I know you've written numerous articles on this. We're not going to tender all of them as exhibits, but I do have what I understand to be some of the most recent and perhaps most relevant work that we can simply have you identify and mark for the sake of having some further documentary support for what you just said, and that if Mr. Lennon, you could pull up tab 16. Oh. This is actually not what sorry, tab 15, I apologize. And Dr. Ford, this would be a recent technical report or research document that you co-authored?
That's correct.
And you're the lead author?
Yes.
And perhaps we'll just have this marked as the next exhibit. I do have a question actually about this document's origin for you.
Exhibit 786.
Thank you. And that's it. I understood this arose out of a request. Could you describe for the commissioner how it came to be that you wrote this paper and what it was in furtherance of?
This report was written for review by the National Marine Mammal Peer Review Committee in the fall of 2009. It was requested. Advice was requested from Fisheries and Aquaculture Management through the Marine Mammal Coordinator Paul Cottrell at Fisheries and Oceans, and it was to address the question of the minimum requirements of Chinook salmon in order to sustain the current population levels of resident killer whales and to provide sufficient food for population recovery to levels higher than they are today.
Is it fair to describe this effort as something in the nature of an integrated approach to ecosystem management or ecosystem-based management?
Yes, I believe so. It is the intent was to work towards integrating the requirements of resident killer whales, one of the primary predators of Chinook salmon, into the management of fisheries for Chinook salmon. And
have you seen any comparable efforts to effectively co-manage marine mammals and salmon during your time at DFO?
I have not, no.
Have you seen any efforts to provide marine mammal science advice to sockeye fisheries managers?
I have not in my 10 years with DFO.
And have you had any other perhaps less formal interactions with fisheries managers? For example, have you ever been asked to make presentations to fisheries harvest planning committees or things of that nature?
Yes, I've made presentations to the Fisheries and Aquaculture Management Group here in Vancouver on the subject of salmon predation by resident killer whales, and also to have had meetings with salmon managers, Jeff Grout, for example, again along with Paul Cottrell, who's our main liaison. He's in Fisheries and Aquaculture Management, but he's our main liaison between science and marine mammal science and management. And
just two more questions on killer whales. The first is about transients. You've heard this morning evidence about the complexity of food webs, the fact that food webs are not two-way relationships. There's many parties involved, and I'm wondering if it has been hypothesized that transients may be having an indirect effect on Fraser River sockeye.
The indirect effect of transient killer whales on Fraser River sockeye would be dependent on the extent to which the prey of transient killer whales feed on that particular resource. As we've heard, and I'm sure will in greater detail, there's some question about the extent to which the prey of transient killer whales, specifically Pacific white-sided dolphins, harbor seals, stellar sea lions, to the extent to which each of these species preys on Fraser River sockeye. There's a lot of uncertainty in that regard, but indeed there is certainly the possibility for what are called top-down effects on these prey populations, where killer whales mammal-hunting killer whales could reduce the population abundance of their prey, such as harbor seals and sea lions, etc., and thereby indirectly affect lift predation pressure on the suite of species that those prey animals are indeed themselves preying on.
My final question is something that I forgot to do before, which is refer you to tab 18 of my list of documents, which is your recent paper on the diets of offshore killer whales. Could you confirm that?
It is.
And could we mark this as the next exhibit, please? Just very quickly, Dr. Trites, is there anything that Dr. Ford's said in the last 10 minutes that you have cause to disagree with?
No, I think it's just fascinating the amount of attention's been paid and how often, I think the lesson out of this is that often what we think is going on, once we spend more time looking carefully, is not what's actually happening. So initial reaction might have been they should be eating lots of sockeye, but the research that Dr. Ford has shown is that that was an incorrect assumption. The data show otherwise.
And in contrast, and very quickly, Pacific white-sided dolphins, I understand, is DFO doing research on Pacific white-sided dolphins' abundance, distribution, diet, anything of that nature?
Our field research is funded almost entirely by the Species at Risk Act, and so ostensibly is targeting these particular species when we undertake field work either on DFO ships or in our smaller vessels coast-wide. So we collect information on all the species of cetaceans that we encounter. So one could say these would be opportunistic observations and data collection on Pacific white-sided dolphins. The only targeted work that we have undertaken is some 3 years of funding from the Strait of Georgia Ecosystem Research Initiative, which provided funds for us to examine the stomach contents of small cetaceans in the Strait of Georgia region. So that this enabled us to look at the stomach contents from stranded individuals of Dall's porpoise, harbor porpoise, and Pacific white-sided dolphins to look at their diet. But that would be the only directed studies on those species.
Do you think that the Pacific white-sided dolphin's abundance, distribution, and diet should be a priority for DFO research? And in particular with respect to its potential impacts on Fraser River sockeye?
I think that there certainly is far too little known about the foraging ecology, the diet, the distribution and abundance of Pacific white-sided dolphins, as well as numerous other cetaceans on the coast. There's in total 25 different cetaceans known from the waters of British Columbia, and some of these are far more poorly known than even the Pacific white-sided dolphin, but they're certainly, given the documented predation on salmonids by Pacific white-sided dolphins, and the recent abundance survey that indicated that there are substantial numbers of them on the British Columbia coast, that greater work would be warranted to help fill those gaps.
We have your presentation materials to the PSC, and we have Dr. Trites' report, and I'm not going to turn to those, but do either of you view the Pacific white-sided dolphin as having a real potential, in contrast to, say, a hypothetical potential, a real potential to have a significant predation impact on Fraser River sockeye? And in answering that question, I'd ask you to reference what direct evidence exists of dolphin predation on sockeye.
The evidence for predation on sockeye is primarily from a single study done by University of British Columbia master's student, Kathy Heisey, from prey fragment sampling in areas on the Central Coast and northern Vancouver Island in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s. And she collected samples and was able to identify the prey species in, I believe, 63 incidents of predation, and documented predation from these samples on sockeye, coho, and pink salmon. And then also there has been, she looked at stomach contents of some animals that were bycatch in gill nets, incidentally drowned. These had chum salmon in their stomach. So this is the extent to which we understand really that that they do prey on salmonids, in addition to many other species of prey. So they do not appear to be a salmonid specialist like a resident killer whale, for example, but they have the ability to prey on a wide size range of different species, including salmonids, right from first-year smolts to adult returning fish up to about 60 centimeters, which would include returning adult sockeye. So again, given their widespread occurrence in both inshore waters, offshore waters, and their substantial abundance on the coast, then they could indeed have play some role in the overall cumulative predation impacts on Fraser River sockeye and other species.
I'm going to ask Dr. Treitz to answer that same question briefly, but I'm going to ask Mr. Lunn if you could pull up tab 19, which I believe is the Kathy Heisey study that the witness was referring to. And while you're doing that, what's your perspective on that question?
I agree with the comments made about diets. I think the one interesting thing with the white-sided dolphins is how their distribution appears to have shifted over the past 20 years. They were, if you look at probably about the only data we have available from the cetacean sightings, I'm sure called network or database, maintained at the Vancouver Aquarium. And those are reports that mariners have given of when they've seen different species. And looking prior to, about 2000, they were commonly found on the offshore waters, and the first time, for example, in the Strait of Georgia, first report in that database is 1994, and then later in 1999. But in the last 10 years, they've been seen every single year, and they started first more in seasonal spring and fall, then filling in the summer, and over the past 12 months, we're now finding they're here year-round. And so that's been a big change in their distribution, and it seems to be coast-wide that they're now more in the inside water. Whether that has an impact on salmonids, I think time will tell.
And Dr. Ford, is the article that's, the publication that's on the screen, the Heisey study that you were referring to?
Yes, it is.
Could I have that marked as the next exhibit, please?
788.
And if we could just quickly turn to page 3 of this paper, or sorry, PDF page 3. And in the top corner, there's a table. Tell me if I've interpreted this right, Dr. Ford. When I look at sockeye salmon, I see 4 samples. And you've told us already that resident killer whales, and you found only 4 samples of sockeye in their diet. I'm wondering, if I've understood this correctly, why only 4 instances of sockeye found as Pacific white-sided dolphin prey would be translated into a assessment that they may have potentially significant predation impacts.
Well, in the case of the 4 samples from resident killer whales, this was in a much larger sample of over 800 kills collected extensively on the coast. I think what makes this more compelling is that that it's a small sample size of only 63 kills if you total up that column with number there. And so the 4 of 63 is significant, I believe. And also, you can see there's a greater number of pink salmon, which are 11 in this case, 11 of 63 samples. Those several of those fish were rather large. They were adult size, and would put them in the same sort of range of potential prey as sockeye salmon. So I think what's important to keep in mind looking at the diet of these animals is they're very likely opportunistic predators. Unlike the resident killer whale, which seem to be highly specialized and ignore alternative prey species even when they're in great abundance like sockeye salmon, far more likely is that Pacific white-sided dolphins prey opportunistically on whatever species is the highest availability and is the most profitable for them at the time and location that they are found or that they're present. And so potentially during the migratory phase, the great pulse of abundance of sockeye salmon, when they're moving through the habitat of these dolphins, I would imagine that they're very likely that the sockeye would play a much more important role in their diet at that time and location. So.
And one very narrow question for you, Dr. Treitz, unless there's something.
Could I just comment on that? I think it's important to keep in mind that not all species of salmons are likely to be equally accessible or vulnerable. The species have evolved different strategies to avoid being preyed upon. Some are tight schools, move faster, some may be more loose, some like Chinook may be more single. And it probably takes a different strategy to capture the different species. So we shouldn't just assume that they're all equally vulnerable.
I'm wondering if your current graduate students have found any sockeye salmon in their recent field work.
No.
Thanks. One very quick question about Dahl's purpose for the two of you before we turn to pinnipeds. And the question is, given their comparable abundance to Pacific white-sided dolphins numerically, and given the very small sample size of only 13 stomachs, why is it that, tell me if I'm wrong, again, you would rule out Dahl's purpose while not ruling out Pacific white-sided dolphin?
The only abundance estimate we have is from that same study that I referred to earlier that led to the abundance estimate for Pacific white-sided dolphin of 25,000, and I believe that their estimate for Dahl's porpoise was substantially smaller, perhaps around 5,000 animals coast-wide, and they're distributed widely and in small groups, and in Georgia Strait, we've long wondered whether they may target out-migrating smolts, for example, because the kind of prey that Dahl's porpoise focus on are small fish. There's no evidence that they take any fish as large as a returning adult. So for Dahl's porpoise, it would really be predation on the smolt face, out-migrating smolts that could be of any potential significance. However, based on the records in the Cetacean Sightings Network and our own observations, we do not see any influx of Dahl's porpoise into areas to coincide with the out-migration of sockeye smolts from the Fraser River. There doesn't seem to be any seasonal increase that would lead to any significant mortality. And the stomach samples that we've been able to examine from stranded animals in the Strait of Georgia area have failed to reveal any salmonids. Their prey is dominated by herring and other small schooling fish, but not salmonids.
And that's 13 samples.
Pardon me?
How many samples of?
Yeah, I believe it was 13. It's not a large data set, but it's what we have to work with.
Right. I'm sorry to rush along. I'm going to rush along here. Final question on whales is, Dr. Ford, did you have any substantive disagreements with the Project 8 report submitted by Dr. Treitz and Dr. Christensen?
My only substantive comment would be that I think that the Pacific white-sided dolphin perhaps potentially has a larger role in the suite of predators that may have over the last 20 years been impacting Fraser River sockeye and other sockeye runs. So, and that because of that potential, I think that further research should on this particular species, diet, distribution, abundance, should be included in the list of recommendations from that.
Thanks. You've been waiting very patiently, Mr. Leziak. I'll ask you the same question. Do you have any substantive disagreements with the Project 8 report?
I agreed with the authors that pinnipeds and marine mammals were very unlikely to be responsible for or played a significant role in the anomalously low returns in 2009. As for the general decline in productivity of Fraser River sockeye, I thought that Steller sea lions should have been on their list as a species that warrants more attention.
I understand that you have also provided a table where you've identified what you would characterize as some data errors. Is that fair?
Yeah, in going through the report, I paid particular attention to the pinniped section. That's my specialty. And there were quite a few inaccuracies and omissions, and I felt compelled to flag those just to set the record straight. I provided a table, and I hope that by doing so, we can move on to the more substantive issues dealt with in that report.
Let's do that, but let's mark that as the next exhibit. That would be tab 7 of the Commission's list.
Exhibit 789.
before we move on, this question for both Dr. Treitz and Mr. Elysiak. For both you, do any of these proposed data corrections in Exhibit 789 have the effect of changing the report's overall assessment of the potential impacts of individual marine mammal species on Fraser River sockeye? Are these corrections, or do they amend potentially the report's conclusions?
No, they're corrections for the most part. The only, again, substantive conclusion that I didn't see eye to eye with were the Steller sea lions and their potential role in the long-term decline in productivity of sockeye. And in fairness to the authors of the report, we recently completed a study, and there's new information that's available on the importance of salmon and sockeye in the diet of Steller sea lions that wasn't available when the authors wrote the report.
Was that a frustration in writing the report of the availability of information on pinnipeds?
It is, and we were aware of it because I'm also a co-author on that report. But at the same time, it wasn't yet in a form that could be cited. So there were certainly some documents that became official, and we did not have access to it at the time.
And happily, we do have them now. And I'm going to ask a couple questions about seals, and then turn to that Steller sea lion issue. One important question, I think, is in terms of abundance. Can you explain to the Commissioner the population trends in harbor seals over the last 25 years?
Okay, well, over the last, actually starting in about 1970 when seals were protected, we saw quite a dramatic increase of populations were growing at 12%, at which rate they double in size every 6 or 7 years. And that growth continued through the 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s, resulting in a tenfold increase in harbor seal abundance. Since the mid-late 1990s, the population appears to have stabilized. Now, you need to put that in perspective of the longer-term historic trends. Harbor seals were depleted by commercial harvests and predator control programs from the late 1800s all the way through to the mid-1960s. And what we saw in the 70s and 80s, those dramatic increases were really the recovery of populations, and now the population appears to have stabilized at roughly the same levels that we saw in the late 1800s before there were any large-scale kills.
Moving from abundance to diet studies, we've already heard that you did a number of diet studies in the Strait of Georgia in the 1980s. I'm wondering if you could please indicate the results of those studies with respect to salmon, the percentage of salmon in harbor seals diets, the percentage of sockeye to the extent that's known, and also the age of salmon that appear to be eaten by harbor seals.
Yeah, the diet study indicated that the main prey of harbor seals were hake and herring. Salmon constituted a small part of the overall diet, about 4%. Seals mainly consumed adult-sized fish, and predation was concentrated in estuaries and at river mouths in the lower parts of rivers where seals congregated when salmon were returning to spawn. And in those areas, salmon can be a very important part of the diet. But since there's relatively a small proportion of the overall population in those estuaries and river mouths, and they are only there for a portion of the year, when you average it out, that's why salmon are overall a small part of the diet. As for species composition, this was based on scat analysis. At that time, we had no means of accurately determining species of salmon. The genetic techniques had not yet been developed, so we were unable to directly assess species composition. However, if you look at where and when seals were preying on salmon relative to what the availability of various species of salmon would have been in those areas and at those times. They're feeding on all 5 species of Pacific salmon, and I imagine that sockeye is a relatively large fraction of what they take, especially in areas like the Fraser River.
But you don't have data, that's a speculation on that last point, that Fraser River, that sockeye, you think may be a large portion. That work hasn't been done to assess that. You don't have that data.
No, we don't have that data, and I don't think it's actually will affect our general conclusion that harbor seals were not a significant factor. Even if they were feeding on mainly sockeye, they still would not have consumed enough to have a significant impact.
That's helpful clarification. The diet research that you did is from the, as I understand, the mid-1980s. It's for the Strait of Georgia. What updates do you need on that research, both temporally and geographically? What should be done to update it?
Like harbor seal is a fairly crude tool. I think it's useful for looking at broad-scale patterns and identifying key prey species. But it lacks, it's difficult to collect large numbers of seal scats, unlike sea lion scats. And even if you were to apply genetic analysis, I think it would just give you a general crude overview of the diet. What we have done after that general diet studies, in the 90s, we spent considerable effort in particular estuaries where we had identified salmon to be a major part of the diet, going in there, doing very detailed observations, tagging animals and tracking their movements, doing surface observations, looking at where and when they were feeding on salmon, collecting scales to identify species composition. So that is a more, I think, useful tool once you've identified sort of areas that you want to focus detailed studies.
Has there been a detailed study in the Fraser River estuary?
No.
I'm apologize, Mr. Christian, I'm about 15 minutes behind my estimate, so we'll just make use of the next 6 minutes and hopefully I can wrap up after the break. In the same vein of looking at abundance and diet and turning to stellar sea lions, what's your best abundance estimate, Mr. Lysiuk, for stellar sea lions currently in British Columbian waters?
About 32,000 during the summer breeding season to 48,000 during the winter non-breeding season.
And are you able to, I'll move on from that question. Actually, your answer is really clear. You've recently, with your co-author and other co-authors, released an in-press report on stellar sea lion diet.
Correct.
And I believe that's at tab 21 of our materials. Is this the report that you've been working on recently?
It is.
And is it finalized? Will it go through any more substantive changes?
It has gone through our internal peer review process, and there were some minor revisions will be made and have been made, none of which will affect the substantive conclusions.
Could we please have this marked as the next exhibit?
Exhibit number 790.
Perhaps, Mr. Lysiuk, rather than go through the report page by page, I know this is a significant amount of work that you've put into this, and I don't want to diminish that, but perhaps you could just give us an overall description of the approach you took in the report and the main components of the study, the things that you looked at. What does this study look at?
Okay, well, this was really the first major study to look at the importance of salmon in the diet of stellar sea lions. The study area, the project is funded by the Pacific Salmon Commission through their Southern Endowment Fund. Our study area was southern BC and Washington State, so from Cape Caution on the central coast to the Columbia River. And what we did is we integrated information on our abundance estimates for stellar sea lions, their seasonal distribution, their activity patterns based on satellite telemetry, and diet analysis based on scat collections and DNA analysis of species of salmon, and integrated all that into coming up with estimates of the importance of salmon in the overall diet.
And what is that estimate? What were your results?
It's just under 11% of the overall diet is made up of salmon.
And how confident are you in those results? Is that with absolute certainty? Is that a
It's a scientifically defensible estimate. There are fairly wide CVs, coefficients of variation associated with the estimate, probably on the order of about 35%. But considering all of the components that go into that estimate and the sources, cumulative sources of variability, it is, I think, a relatively defensible estimate.
And what is the estimate of the amount of sockeye within that 11%?
Well, we've only been able to so far analyze 1/3 of the scat samples that contain salmon. And so based on those preliminary results, again, Steller sea lions are generalists. They feed on all 5 species of Pacific salmon as well as steelhead. And sockeye made up at least 5% of the salmon that have been identified so far. And there were some of the samples were ambiguous. We can only, based on the DNA results to date, narrow it down to 1 of 2 species of salmon, and a lot of those could have been either pink or sockeye. And so there was another 15% that were either pink or sockeye. So until we resolve those ambiguities, and I think that we will with further testing, but right now it's 5 to 20% potentially of the salmon identified were sockeye.
And why were you only able to analyze 1/3 of the samples?
Just due to the amount of funding that was available. We actually, for this study, obtained far more scat samples than we had originally planned. All kinds of other researchers, including Andrew Trites, contributed samples that they had collected. That was great, and that provided bigger sample sizes, but we only had the funding to do 1/3 of the DNA analysis.
And have you submitted any application to DFO requesting funding to assess the remaining 2/3 of those samples?
I have.
And what's been the result of that funding application?
The proposal's been well received, but so far we haven't identified a source of funding. This year, we're just entering a new fiscal year. There's some uncertainty with the political situation, but our request for funding will be considered amongst division priorities and fiscal restraint. That's what I'm told.
Yeah. And thanks to Mr. Elysiak's succinctness, I will be able to finish in 15 minutes.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.